Okay, so we're going back to this version of the notes because there's not actually a PowerPoint for this, because when we do it in class, I usually have it on the doc cam and you guys just kind of follow along with me. But we'll go back to this way for today. So again, this is going to be notes number 2, and then we'll go ahead and get started and fill these out as we go. Number 1, a plant that has flowers and produces seeds, that's going to be an angiosperm. Make sure you guys can see that, okay? An angiosperm. And just to kind of help us remember that, we're going to draw a little flower out to the side here. This is any kind of plant that produces a flower that will help make the seeds. Number 2, a small growth at the tip or on the side of a stem that later will develop into a flower or a branch. That's going to be a bud. B-U-D. A flower bud. Fun fact, this is where the phrase nip it in the bud comes from. It refers to when you want to cut something off right away as opposed to letting it develop further on and then cutting it off. You want to nip it in the bud. Number 3, this is released from animals during respiration, and plants use this to make their own food. You should know this by now. It's going to be carbon dioxide. And hopefully you remember the chemical formula for that, which is going to be CO2. Either one would work. Number 4, a tree or bush that has cones, usually an evergreen. The key here is going to be the word cones. This is going to be a conifer. It has the word cone in it. C-O-N-I-F-E-R, conifer. Number 5, one of the 2 groupings of flowering plants that have 2 seed leaves, both of which can photosynthesize for the seedling until the foliage leaves can take over to supply nutrients from the plant. We will study more about these later, but it does have to do with the root for 2, like we talked about earlier. There's going to be what's called a dicot, which is short for a really big word, dicotyledon. But we usually just call them dicots for short. It's much easier. Number 6, the act of spreading evenly is diffusion. D-I-F-F-U-S-I-O-N. That's going to be just like a diffuser would work, spreading evenly through a room. Number 7, a mature zygote. We'll talk about what this means in a little bit later on, but it just means a fertilized egg that will develop later on into a different organism. A mature zygote in the female ovule of a plant that will eventually become a seed. That's going to be an embryo. Number 8, the result of the sperm uniting with an egg. The sperm is going to be the male sex cell. The egg is going to be the female sex cell. And when those 2 unite in a plant, it's called fertilization. Number 9, this one's super easy. A plant in which the flower is the reproductive organ is called a flowering plant. Not every plant will use a flower to reproduce, but if it does, it's called a flowering plant. Number 10, a mature sex cell, whether it's the male sperm or the female, which is the egg, that's going to be called the gamete, G-A-M-E-T-E. The key for fertilization is you have to have 1 male and 1 female that come together. Okay, but each separate sex cell is called the gamete. Number 11, the process of the growth of an embryo in a plant is called germination. When it germinates, that just means that the plant is beginning to grow. That's a good thing, especially if you're a gardener. Number 12, everyone should know this one by now. That's sugar. It's going to be glucose. Which, if you can email me the scientific formula for glucose, I'll be pretty impressed. Number 13, a plant such as a conifer that produces uncovered seeds. The thing about angiosperms is they produce their seeds covered inside of the flower. The gymnosperm, which is going to be number 13, produces uncovered seeds. Gymno, spelled just like a gym, like a gymnasium. Gymnosperme. ERM, no E. Okay. All right, going on to number 14. Ooh, my pen kind of bled through a little bit. Number 14. Let me make sure we're lined up so you can see. Okay. Kind of, sort of. That's better. One of the two groupings of flowering plants that has one seed leaf, usually enclosed in a sheath that surrounds and protects the roots. This is the same thing as the dicotyledon, but a dicot has to do with, has two seed leaves. A monocot, which is short for monocotyledon, which, like I said, we call monocot for short, is where they only have one seed leaf. Okay, so that root mono right there means one. Number 15, a plant that produces no flowers. If we call a plant that produces flowers a flowering plant, we call a plant that produces no flowers a non-flowering plant. Really difficult there. Non-flowering plant. Number 16, an example of non-vascular plants, which are small and usually live in places that are always wet. They grow on soil, barks of trees, and rock. We did a little bit of studying on moss earlier yesterday. No, at this point, 2 days ago. But this is going to be moss. Number 17, a plant that lacks specialized tissue. That's going to be a plant that lacks those tubes or vein-like structures within the plant, and therefore it depends on the processes of diffusion and osmosis to move materials. That's going to be a non-vascular plant. Okay, we'll talk more about this when we get into the notes, but the word vascular is the same thing that we refer to like the veins in our arms or in our body and our legs. Those are tube-like structures that transport, for us, our blood through and nutrients and oxygen throughout our body. If a plant does not have quote-unquote veins to transport nutrients and water and things, just like our veins do, except for we transport blood, obviously, but then we call that a non-vascular plant, meaning it non-veins or not having veins. Yeah, we'll get more into that later. Number 18. In seed-bearing plants, the place where the fertilization takes place and the seeds mature, this is going to be the ovary. And then number 18, last part says, when mature, the ovary is called a fruit, and that's true, which we'll talk more about later in just a little bit as well. Number 19, when you transfer of high water concentration to low water concentration is called osmosis. Fun word to say, osmosis. OSMOSIS. Number 20, you could probably guess, the brightly colored part of the plant designed to attract animal pollinators. That's the petal. That's their whole purpose, is to attract insects for pollination. Number 21, a specialized vascular plant tissue that are tube-like structures. They transport sugar molecules, which are made in the leaves, to the other parts of the plant and store it for later use. This is going to be the phloem. Phloem, pronounced phloem. The way you remember this is, I'll teach you the little rap for it later, but phloem transports food and tissues down. Okay, the other tissue called xylem, which we'll get to in a little bit, that transports water and nutrients up. I'll teach you the rap for that when we get to it later. Number 22, a plant life process that traps sunlight and uses carbon dioxide and water to form carbohydrates or simple sugars. That one is photosynthesis. Okay, if you remember that root, photo means light. Okay, meaning it needs to use light to complete that process. Number 23, the female reproductive structure in a plant, which is also known as the carpel. This has two different names. If it's not called the carpel, it's called the pistil. Now, be careful, this is not pistil like pew-pew pistil. That kind of pistil is spelled P-I-S-T-O-L. This kind of pistil, talking about the female part of the flower, is P-I-S-T-I-L. Okay, the pistil. 24, the act of transferring pollen from anther to stigma. We'll talk later about what the anther and stigma are, but that process is pollination. '25, the leafless underground part of a plant that stores food and holds the plant in place. You can probably guess that's the root. Okay. Moving this back down, let me make sure you can see still. Okay. 26, stems that grow above the ground in vegetative or asexual reproduction. All that means is it doesn't have to have that male and female gamete come together. It can just kind of clone itself. We talked about how bacteria does that way back when. But again, we'll talk more about this in detail coming up. But this is called a runner. Runners. 27, one of the outermost structures of a flower. These protect the young flower while it begins to develop. That is called the sepal. S-E-P-A-L, sepal. Number 28, a means of reproduction in which the male and female gametes join. That's the opposite of asexual. It's called sexual reproduction. Just means you have to have a male and female involved, or at least a male gamete and a female gamete that have to come together. 29, reproductive plant bodies that are usually one-celled, each able to develop into a new organism. That is a spore. S-P-O-R-E. Spores. We'll get more into that later as well. Number 30, you could probably guess as well, the main stalk of a plant that develops buds and sprouts and usually grows above the ground. That is a stem. 31, if the female reproductive structure was the pistil, the male reproductive structure in flowering plants is called the stamen. The easiest way to remember this one is it ends in M-E-N, like men, the stamen. 32, the top of the pistil or carpel is called the stigma. Again, I'll explain that later on. 33, a tiny opening in the outer layer of a plant through which oxygen is released during photosynthesis. It's called a stoma. Okay, if you want to make it plural, meaning talking about more than one opening, that would be stomata. Kind of a fun word to say. 34, a plant that has specialized tissues called xylem and phloem, meaning it has those veins or it has those tube-like structures to transfer material, is called a vascular plant. Again, just like our vascular system in our body. And then 35, a specialized vascular plant tissue that transports water and nutrients from the roots to the leaves. This is the vein that transports the things up, or the water nutrients up from the ground up to the rest of the plant. That is the xylem. X-Y-L-E-M.